Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we're diving straight into a massive study guide on early America. We're going to literally step into the shoes of the very first colonists to understand the harsh realities of just surviving, how they built an unbelievable economic engine, and how their literal backyards became the battlegrounds for global proxy wars. So focus in and let's get right into it.
Here's our roadmap for the day. First up, two worlds, Virginia and the North. Second, the colonial economic engine. Third, empires collide. And finally, the revolution.
Okay, jumping right into part one, two worlds, Virginia and the North. So imagine for a second that you're an early settler stepping off a boat into a totally unknown wilderness. Depending on exactly where you landed, your motives, and really your entire society were completely different. Down in the Virginia colony at Jamestown, established in 1607, the drive was basically a pure financial venture backed by the London Company. I mean, these folks landed in a marshy, mosquito-filled swamp on the James River, suffered terribly from disease, and then eventually had to pivot to agriculture and cash crops just to survive. Now, contrast that with the New England colony up at Plymouth, founded in 1620. These were Puritans. They were fleeing Europe for religious freedom, drafted the Mayflower Compact to self-govern, and built an economy that relied heavily on maritime trade and really tight-knit communities. So right out of the gate, we're looking at two entirely different foundations for what would eventually become one single nation. But here's the thing. Virginia's pivot to a massive agricultural economy, that required immense, back-breaking labor. And that leads us directly to a very dark milestone, the year 1619. Just 12 years after Jamestown was founded, an English privateer ship brought 20 to 30 enslaved Africans to Point Comfort, Virginia, where they were sold or traded to the settlement. And this marked the truly harrowing beginning of 2.5 centuries of chattel slavery in what would eventually become the United States. Which brings us to Section 2, the colonial economic engine.
To really grasp this era, you absolutely have to understand the triangle trade. It essentially worked like a gruesome machine. Step 1, enslaved people were brutally transported from Africa across the Atlantic to the Americas and the Caribbean. Step 2, those slave ships would unload their human cargo and then load up on commodities like sugar and molasses, which were in huge demand up in New England. Step 3, the New England colonies would take that sugar, distill it into rum, and then ship that rum, along with other goods, right back to Africa to trade for more enslaved people. And it just kept going. It was this cyclical, horrific engine of wealth.
And the sheer scale of the human cost powering this economy is honestly staggering. Between 1600 and 1625, roughly 300,000 enslaved people were brought to the Americas. But look at how that volume absolutely explodes. Between 1751 and 1775, that number skyrocketed to over 2 million. This entire economic boom was fueled directly by immense human suffering. At the exact same time, this thriving maritime and agricultural economy created a massive population boom for the colonists themselves. Back in the year 1700, there were maybe 250,000 colonists. Just 50 years later, by 1750, that population had surged to over 1.25 million. So think about what that means. This explosive growth meant the North American landmass was becoming incredibly valuable, and not just to the folks living there, but to the monarchs sitting on thrones thousands of miles away in Europe. And that leads us to Section 3, Empires Collide in America. Put yourself back in the shoes of a settler or a Native American living out on the frontier. Suddenly, you are caught in a century-long pattern of proxy wars. We're talking about conflicts like King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War. Now, these conflicts rarely started in America. They usually kicked off over some vacant throne or a random trade dispute over in Europe. But the ground-level reality here in the colonies was just brutal. Borders were constantly shifting, colonial militias were fighting French and Spanish troops, and Native American tribes were completely caught in the crossfire. They suffered immense devastation, basically forced to ally with one European power or another just to survive. But then, in 1754, that pattern completely changed. Because this time, the spark started right here. The royal governor of Virginia sent a young 22-year-old major in the colonial militia out to remove French troops from forts in the Ohio River Valley. And that young major's name? George Washington. Yeah, that George Washington. His little skirmish with French troops and their native allies totally spiraled out of control. He was forced to build Fort Necessity, got surrounded, and actually had to surrender. So this highly localized conflict out in the American wilderness essentially set the entire world on fire, kicking off the French and Indian War. But to really understand this war, we have to look at its true global context. The French and Indian War actually ignited what's known as the 7 Years' War, which was fought all over the globe: Europe, India, the Caribbean, Asia. And just think about the massive disparity in casualties here. We're talking roughly 23,000 in North America compared to an astronomical 1.37 million globally. The settlers' incredibly bloody fight for their own backyards was literally just a tiny 2% fraction of a massive global struggle for imperial dominance. Ultimately, by 1763, the British won the war and expelled the French from North America entirely. But here's the million-dollar question. How exactly does an empire pay off a massive global war? I mean, 1.4 million casualties don't come cheap. The British government was staring down an enormous debt, and they looked across the ocean at their wealthy, booming American colonies and basically decided, you know what, it's time for them to foot the bill. Which brings us to our final section, Revolution and the Virginia Coast. The economic tension snapped remarkably fast. In 1764, the British Parliament passes the Sugar Act. 1765, the Stamp Act. 1767, the Townshend Acts. And the colonists are absolutely furious. Because to them, this wasn't just about paying more for paper or glass or tea. As British subjects, they firmly believed they had a fundamental constitutional right to representation in Parliament. Their rallying cry famously became, "No taxation without representation." These tensions just kept boiling over. Cue the Boston Tea Party in 1773, until we hit the breaking point. The shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. The rebellion was officially on. By July 4th, 1776, this wasn't just a rebellion over taxes anymore. It was a full-blown revolution for complete independence. The Second Continental Congress officially signed the Declaration of Independence, penned largely by Thomas Jefferson, with that famous line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The colonies were now operating as independent states, totally unified by a common enemy. But look, writing a declaration is one thing, actually winning a war against an empire is another entirely. Ground yourself in the brutal, everyday reality of this fight for a second. General George Washington was commanding a ragtag, mostly untrained continental militia. These guys were constantly freezing, completely lacking basic gear like shoes, and were literally forced to forage the countryside just to find a meal. And opposing them? The British regulars, literally the greatest, most well-supplied, highly disciplined professional military on the planet. Honestly, for the first few years of the war, Washington's main strategy was basically just trying to keep his army from being completely wiped out. But then, after a miraculous American victory at Saratoga in 1777, everything shifted. The French, who were super eager to get revenge on the British after the 7 Years' War, saw that the Americans might actually have a real chance. So, in 1778, they signed the French alliance. This is an absolutely crucial turning point. It finally brought vital foreign naval power and professional, well-equipped land support to Washington's freezing, starving troops. And this crucial alliance culminates in a brilliant strategic climax in the summer of 1781. Step 1. George Washington and French General Rochambeau secretly marched their combined land forces south down to Virginia. Step 2. They somehow managed to trap British General Charles Cornwallis and his entire army on the peninsula at Yorktown. Step 3. They unleash a massive artillery bombardment. But Cornwallis thinks he can just hold out. He's assuming the incredibly powerful British Navy will simply sail down the coast and rescue his men. And here is exactly where the eastern shore of Virginia literally changes the world. Right off the coast, the Battle of the Virginia Capes takes place. The French Navy intercepts the British Navy and totally defeats them. The French warships completely secure the coast, entirely cutting off Cornwallis's only possible sea escape route. So, surrounded by American and French troops on land and completely blocked by the French Navy by sea, Cornwallis is forced to surrender on October 19, 1781, effectively ending the war. The Treaty of Paris officially recognized the United States as a free and sovereign nation. But as we wrap up our study guide today, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought. We saw right at the start how drastically different Virginia and New England were from the very beginning. So once they were finally united by a common enemy, how in the world would these radically different, fiercely independent colonies actually learn to govern themselves as one single nation without tearing each other apart? Now that is the chaotic, incredibly fascinating aftermath of the Revolution, and it's a story for another day. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep studying, and I will see you next time.